Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning and good evening based on some of the time zones we saw registering here. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Transitioning to a Zero Trust Network Access Model and SMB Perspective. Glad to have you here with us today. I see a few folks are still logging in. We're going to get started, though. We're just at 2 minutes past here. So thank you again. My name is Matt Mehus. I am the VP of Growth at OpenVPN, and I'm very excited to have our featured guest speaker here today, John Grady, Principal Analyst from Enterprise Strategy Group. So excited to share some information today on transitioning to Zero Trust and SMB perspective. Before we get into the agenda here, though, a couple of quick housekeeping items that I want to make sure that everyone is aware of here. So everyone's line is going to be on mute. We don't want to have any potentially disruptive background noise, dogs barking, things like that. With that said, if you do have questions, we ask that you enter them into the Q&A box. We'll address those here at the end of today's session. Unless there are specific questions that pertain to things that we'll discuss, we could answer them as we go as well. So everyone's line is unmuted. We ask that you enter any questions into the Q&A box. The call is being recorded, so we'll share this with all registrants here after today's call. If you want to revisit some of the stats that John's going to share or share with folks who weren't able to attend. And then lastly here, we're going to have a couple of polls that we'll put up here as well and encourage your engagement there to see what how you and your peers on the call here might stand up against some of the stats that John will share here as well. So with that said, thank you again for those that are able to join. I see our number slowly rolling here still. Let's jump into the agenda, though, and then we'll get kicked off. So for today, we're going to start with the state of Zero Trust Network Access adoption, or ZTNA adoption. We'll talk a little bit about key takeaways for small to medium-sized businesses. A lot of what we're going to talk through today will highlight some best practices from enterprise deployments. We want to understand how this impacts on the small to medium-sized business segment here as well. We'll talk a little bit about an SMB roadmap for making the move, talk through some of the fundamentals and pitfalls and concerns that we hear from customers who are actively going through this from the SMB perspective. And then we will get into a Q&A at the end. So with that said, I'm going to give just a brief introduction to John, and then we'll get started here. So you'll see his areas of expertise on the right there. Principal Analyst John Grady uses his nearly 20 years of IT vendor and analyst experience to help clients identify and understand key market trends, refine their messaging, and be more successful in the marketplace. So with that, John, thank you again for your time and your expertise here today. I will pass it over to you, and I will progress the slides, but we'll get started.
And so, Matt, I'm going to say the perils of live TV here. My monitor just went out, so I do have a copy of the deck up. I'm going to be able to roll through, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to look directly at the camera, so I apologize, or see you for that matter. So I apologize for optics. Hopefully this comes back as we go. But if we can just go to the first slide, I'll start off, and thank you for that intro. As you said, we're going to talk about ZTNA in particular, and try to highlight aspects from an SMB perspective. As you said, the study was broad, all types of organizations. But as we go, I think there's some strong learnings we can take from what we found with enterprise and mid-market organizations, kind of apply to the SMB. So, foundationally, even though we're talking about ZTNA, I think it's helpful to understand kind of how organizations are thinking about zero trust more broadly, as kind of a starting point. And so we've asked this question a couple different times over the past few years relative to how you think about zero trust. And there's three definitions here. We ask organizations to respond two different ways, kind of select all. What do you agree with? Generally, it can be more than one. And then what best aligns with your organization's view of zero trust? And the key word in these definitions is really up front. The first one is focused on a security strategy. The next two more from a technology point of view. You see security technologies called out. And, I think the positive here is 2/3 of organizations say that their organization kind of use zero trust as a security strategy. You can see one that denies access by default, enforces least privilege, employs continuous monitoring, so on and so forth. And that's a noticeable shift from what we found in the past, where less than half of organizations felt that way. There was a lot more focus on tools and technologies, and I think a lot of that was vendor led. 4 or 5 years ago, as zero trust was first coming on the scene, if you buy this tool and deploy it, you have zero trust. There's less of that now. There's more awareness, and so a lot of organizations are thinking about this more as an architecture or a strategy, which is a positive development. Glass half empty. There's still about a third of organizations who are focused on tools, so there's still some awareness to go. But some of this is just perception, because you ultimately do need tools and technologies to kind of operationalize a strategy. So some of it is just, what's your starting point, what's your kind of your high level view as you get into tools. So if we can go to the next slide, with an understanding of what zero trust is, the question becomes kind of where are organizations with it? And you can see just about 70% say they've implemented or begun to implement zero trust broadly across the organization. That's as opposed to doing it for specific use cases or aspects of the environment. There's about 26% of organizations that indicated they were following that type of approach, and only 6% of the organizations we spoke to said they were just in the planning stage. Now, granted, we were targeting organizations that were more familiar and more focused on zero trust, so this isn't necessarily indicative of the market as a whole, that every organization is focused on zero trust. That's certainly not what we're saying. But the level at which organizations are taking a more holistic approach was really noteworthy. We saw a majority in the past being more targeted in how they were deploying zero trust. We'll talk later on about how from a developing a starting point, starting small, things like that, that does make sense. But the main takeaway here is most organizations are thinking about doing this broadly, at least over time, even if they're not at the beginning. That said, there is a little bit of a difference between enterprise organizations and smaller organizations. So about 3/4 of enterprises say that they're taking zero trust more broadly versus only half of smaller organizations. So again, thinking about this from an SMB perspective, this is not to say that you have to apply zero trust pervasively across your environment. There's not necessarily anything wrong with doing it on a smaller scale, but it's just, I think, educational to understand how organizations are thinking about it and kind of prioritizing it. So on the next slide here, we'll look at some of the reasons why organizations are focused on zero trust. So there's a mix here, which I find interesting, of strategic and tactical drivers that push organizations towards zero trust. And I've highlighted kind of which I equate with which. And on the tactical side, reasons that you would expect. So organizations want to limit the number of security incidents that they have to deal with, limit the pervasiveness of data breaches that they suffer, prevent data exfiltration if attacks do occur, secure remote access for users, which we've seen obviously grow in prevalence over the last few years. Kind of more tactical ideas. How do I improve my level of security? But there's also some strategic drivers that are interesting as well. So at the top of the list, modernizing the cybersecurity program. So the idea that environments are fundamentally different than they were a few years ago. You have users and resources in a number of different locations, and the traditional approach of having kind of defined perimeters and just assuming everything that is within that perimeter is good and everything outside is bad or untrusted, it really doesn't work anymore, because you have traffic that is really internal, but leaving your corporate locations and so on. So you have to rethink your security strategy. You can see the results here, hopefully, that there's good alignment, I think, among the group we have on the webinar today with what we found in our research. And I think a lot of that's driven by kind of the federal focus on zero trust, and the idea of kind of improving security through zero trust has driven some of that awareness around modernizing cybersecurity overall as a zero trust driver. The other piece of this is, how security can enable the business and at a minimum not stand in the way. And so there's a couple drivers towards the bottom of the list here: supporting digital transformation and accelerating cloud adoption. So through a zero trust architecture, you can inspire more confidence in your ability to move workloads to the cloud, and so on. So again, looking at this through the lens of an SMB, would I be as concerned with digital transformation or cloud adoption? In some cases, it depends on your business model. But I think that focus on reducing incidents, preventing incidents from occurring in the first place, and secure access in particular, which is really what we're going to be talking about quite a bit today, are things to really zero in on and focus on. So if we can go to the next slide. There's a lot of positives to take from zero trust. I think it's also educational to understand that organizations that have moved forward with the project, have had, in some cases, encountered roadblocks and had some issues. So on the left side of the slide, you can see that fully a third say that regardless of where they are now, in the past, they've had to either pause or abandon a zero trust project. And there's a variety of reasons why, which you can see on the right. So at the top of the list are organizational issues implementing the project. And again, I think this is probably a little more enterprise oriented. If you think of the size of a large organization and how their IT department may be set up, you might have different teams responsible for network security, for data security, an identity team within the IT organization, a network team, and all those personas and those teams, would have some, input, some say into a zero trust project, and getting them aligned on strategy and tool selection and so on can take time, can be difficult. So from an enterprise perspective, that makes sense. And an SMB may have folks wearing multiple hats, and that may be a little less of an issue. What I've highlighted here in terms of the expense and technical issues, I think, are a little more focused on the SMB side. So, it's interesting. We've actually found organizations that have gone through a zero trust project often claim cost savings at the end, but that involves some planning, up front, and making sure that you have an eye towards kind of, your long-term goals. Because we've seen instances of, purchasing, deploying a tool for a specific use case that couldn't then expand to address, other use cases, other parts of the environment, and that's where kind of cost comes in. Same thing with technical issues in terms of interoperability if that situation occurs. So there's absolutely an opportunity to kind of do some rationalization as far as costs through a zero trust project, but it can involve planning and strategizing up front. So if we move on to the next slide, we've talked a lot about the strategy so far, but as I said earlier, at the end of the day, you do have to implement tools to operationalize it and enforce the policies that you develop as part of a zero trust architecture. So the idea here is especially thinking about this through the lens of an SMB. It's not hopefully oh my God, there's all these tools that I have to think about implementing to support zero trust. It's more to put on the radar things that can be associated with zero trust, depending on what the core focus is. These tools all could have a role, but the main takeaway that I wanted to share with this is how highly rated from an effectiveness perspective ZTNA is. And there's a couple aspects of that. I mean, part of it may be some level of respondent bias, just due to the fact that zero trust is in the name of the tool. But I think more of it is, number one, it meets one of those core drivers that we talked about earlier in terms of facilitating secure access for employees and third parties. And then second, the speed at which these tools can often be deployed, and you can actually get some quick wins through providing that access to smaller groups in the organization and expanding out from there. From a deployment perspective, we've seen a lot of success kind of following that model. And so, I think the focus on that area is kind of well-deserved and a good starting point. So on the next slide, the question becomes kind of where are organizations with ZTNA in particular? So we looked at Zero Trust, kind of within that, that grouping. Then we have ZTNA, and we did phrase this in terms of a VPN replacement, which is, again, to set the stage, Zero Trust tools, ZTNA tools use VPN tunnels. So it's really more the traditional architecture of providing access through a gateway to a user onto the network, and then, stepping back, not running any further checks, and having that user have access to anything on the network is really the kind of the different scenarios that we're trying to describe here. ZTNA versus that traditional remote access model, which was pretty insecure. And so a third of organizations that we spoke to said that they had replaced that traditional secure access model with ZTNA across their whole environment. The vast majority of the rest are working towards that, either supporting most of their remote access needs with ZTNA or using it for specific use cases, but looking to expand over time. The main takeaway here is that only 3% are kind of focused in their usage of ZTNA currently and don't plan to expand. So, again, this has kind of gone from something where I think organizations were thinking about starting small and maybe ending there and staying kind of targeted towards, or now to starting small with an eye towards expanding in the future. So definitely somewhat of a different trend than what we've seen in the past. On the next slide, we can see the reasons that organizations maybe have not fully replaced their traditional secure access model with ZTNA. And a lot of this amounts to either just time, and you can't do everything at once, you have to prioritize, and perception. So that first response, we have plans to move more of our applications to ZTNA and just haven't done so yet. And we see that quite a bit. And obviously, the more complex the environment, the more applications you have, the more user groups that you have to support, the more likely that you may be to select that and have that be a reason why you're taking a phased approach. There's also perception issues. We saw, I think it's been around long enough, we can think of ZTNA kind of in terms of generations. First gen ZTNA was really focused on being cloud-based, supporting cloud applications, supporting web applications in particular. And it can take time for those perceptions to change, even though some, if not many, ZTNA tools now support access to applications, whether they're on premises or in the cloud, and support access to both web and non-web based applications. Some organizations are kind of unclear on that and maybe more targeted in what they're approaching. And then there's complexity as well, which as you get more towards enforcing those zero trust policies, and again, this can depend on the tool, what's the level of usability, right? Improving security is one thing, but it still has to be usable. That's true from a user perspective and an administrator perspective as well. We move to the next slide. This is back to zero trust more broadly and thinking about the tools that are going to support that type of an architecture. But I think there's takeaways here for ZTNA specifically. At the top of the list is AI and ML, and quite frankly, I think anytime we put that on a pick list these days, it's so top of mind for folks. It's going to elicit a lot of responses. But I really kind of couple that with a couple other answer options on this list. So risk assessment and automation of policy creation and management. And that's kind of equated with ease of use. How can I ensure that that allow block decision when I'm granting access is taking a variety of factors into play, and AI can certainly help with that. And then usability, as I'm trying to write these policies that are maybe dependent on the type of device a user is on, where they are, time of day, so on and so forth, can I, elicit from the tool suggestions to make my job easier. So if you think about AI through kind of that context, it's less important whether AI is involved, but if it is, promoting those types of benefits in terms of security and ease of use. Also at the top of the list is consistency. When we think about zero trust, it's really about removing any type of location bias from determining whether entity should be trusted. And to do that, you need consistency from your tool set across both cloud and non-cloud locations, different parts of the environment, and so on. And so that's become more and more critical over time. And then the last aspect here is this idea of platforms, which I think comes back to ease of use as well. And there's two differing kind of answer options here. A tool set being part of an ecosystem with integrations across different technology vendors, and then being part of a broader platform from a single vendor. And again, this, I think, looking at this from an SMB versus an enterprise lens, enterprise organizations, obviously more tools in place, more likely to, or maybe less likely to want to, leverage a single vendor or two vendors. And so that ecosystem aspect becomes more important. For a smaller organization, I think there's more appetite for more of a platform approach to standardize on a single vendor to get economies of scale, better ease of use, and so on. But it's really after the same thing, which is how do I ensure interoperability, make my life easier, and at the end of the day, get better security. So kind of two sides of the same coin. And I think wrapping up here, just a couple key takeaways and highlighting some points that I made earlier. Number one, I think it's important, and this is why I started with a couple of those data points on zero trust overall. Even as an SMB, and even if we're thinking about ZTNA, very specifically, which is important, I think it's helpful to have a broader concept of zero trust, how to think about it, potentially where it can help your organization. There's a lot of information out there now. I mentioned earlier the federal government doing a lot of work in this area. But it just helps provide, I think, better clarity around where ZTNA can help specifically. I think that should probably be the focus for most SMBs. But again, it helps to have that context. In either case, the identification of use cases is really important. And again, I think that secure access piece is going to be important for a lot of SMBs, but for some it might be, applying microsegmentation to workloads or something along those lines, which is fine. But understanding where your greatest risk lies, where your greatest areas of needs are, and then where zero trust can help is really the first step in making sure these projects are a success. And then finally, on the last slide that I showed, in my opinion, prioritizing consistency and ease of use are most important. I think, organizations that have had those false starts, especially on the technical side, I think haven't done that. They haven't done maybe as much due diligence on the tool sets as they needed to, potentially move too fast. We're too focused on the short term and not the long term. And then you get into trouble down the road, even from a technology perspective. So with that, I'll pause and hand it back to Matt.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. I think it's clear that adoption is on the rise, and this is not necessarily a new model necessarily by any means here. But I think like many new models in security and just in other categories and industries in general, a lot of the best practices can come from the enterprise experience. So I'd like to take a few minutes here and talk through some of the fundamentals, pitfalls, and best practices to consider for small businesses. And we hear this, small and medium-sized businesses, I should say, but we hear a lot of this feedback from our customers here as well as they're looking to make this move here. And a lot of what we can take away comes from the success and the failures of how larger enterprise-sized organizations have successfully or not deployed ZTNA across any part of their organization. So let's talk through a couple of these, starting with some of the key fundamentals here. And John, there's a few areas I think that you can add some context as well, but chime in if you have ideas that you'd like to share here as well. So as John mentioned on a couple of his slides here, identity and access management. So users and devices have to be authenticated and authorized based on identity rather than location in this model. And it's a lot of feedback we hear from, again, our SMB customers. So implementing across multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and role-based access control is going to help ensure that only verified individuals can access those right resources at the right time. John, where do you see this fall in sort of how SMBs can make that transition in terms of leveraging IAM and the identity piece?
Yeah, I mean, so I come at it from a network security perspective, and I do tend to kind of focus more on that. But identity is a fundamental component of a zero trust architecture, and so I think MFA is kind of table stakes. If we think about zero trust as, I can't take for granted, something is what they say it is, someone is who they say they are. In trying to remove implicit trust. I think adding another level of authentication is a key part of that. Just because a user has a password, it doesn't necessarily mean they are, who they are. So that's kind of core from an MFA perspective. But at the same time, you can't introduce friction for users. In my opinion, that's where SSO comes in. There's obviously a security component, but you're kind of addressing the security piece while also helping users get access to the tools, the resources that they need quicker, right? And not introducing that friction that causes issues a lot of times and can kind of stall these projects. So yeah, IAM is a core component of this.
Yeah, I think similar in some ways, or not quite as similar maybe, but is the second one here, which is least privilege access. So the principle being that users and devices should have the minimum necessary access to be able to effectively work and be successful here. So continuously evaluating access policies and restricting users' access to only systems and data that are actually needed for their job is going to be critical, and your ability to reduce the attack surface by limiting what users actually can access, even if their credentials are compromised. And then third here, microsegmentation. John, you already mentioned this, but networks should be divided into smaller zones or units where you can control access between them. So segmenting your network into logical units, which, whether it's applications or databases, and enforcing strict access controls for each of those. So a lot of this is tied to your ability and the org's ability to contain threats within these smaller zones.
Yeah, segmentation has been a best practice for security generally for a number of years, and the reality is a lot of organizations still don't do a good job of it. So microsegmentation can elicit kind of a visceral response, because it's been associated with complexity over the years. So I would focus more on the kind of segmentation, more broadly, kind of coarse-grained segmentation. As you said, apps from databases, production from testing, ensuring your financial applications aren't on the same network segment as your public-facing, customer-facing applications, things of that sort. And a lot of that's become easier through technologies like SDN and overlays and things of that sort. So you're not having to fundamentally re-architect the network to apply some of those segmentation aspects. But the goal should be to get as coarse, as fine-grained as you can, but starting coarse-grained, making it that much difficult for attackers to kind of move around if they do get in. Should be the initial goal just to get started.
Yeah. And then continuous monitoring and we should have on here real-time threat detection as well. But the idea that security, as everyone on this call knows, isn't a one-time activity. It's an ongoing process. So implementing solutions, logging, monitoring, automated threat detection solutions, and using tools that will help you proactively monitor user behavior and flag those anomalies, excuse me. But if you can bring that continuous visibility into your network, it's going to help you detect and respond to those threats that much faster. And then device posture and security. the idea that devices have to meet or should meet very specific security standards before accessing your network. So ensuring all of your devices, which could be corporate or bring your own device, BYOD, are up to date with patches, endpoint protection, are configured correctly, so you can help your team and your org identify those weakest links, which in many cases can be the devices. So ensuring that they meet your security posture, so you can help reduce those vulnerabilities.
And again, this one's just about risk. If I'm an attacker, what's the first thing I'm going to do if I've compromised an endpoint? Disable the firewall, disable AV. I may be more apt to be able to compromise a device if it's unpatched. And so, understanding that from a posture assessment perspective can kind of help reduce the likelihood that the device that's accessing your network or your application is actually compromised.
Yeah. Yeah. And then lastly here, encryption. So obviously all communication sensitive data should be encrypted. So encrypting data at rest and in transit using VPNs, SSL, TLS, other encryption technologies. We see a number of customers that speak to us frequently about enforcing transport layer security and also data loss prevention. We see a lot of DLP conversations from our customers going through this transition or making the move here to more of a ZTNA model. So the flip side of this here is really looking at some of the more common pitfalls, and in some cases they are more literally the other side of the coin, if you will, of some of the key fundamentals here. But starting with underestimating complexity. We've seen with our own customers, but even at industry events and elsewhere, that there is sometimes a belief that moving to a ZTNA model is just about implementing a new tool. And in reality, it requires a much more comprehensive overhaul in some cases of your network architecture, your policies, access control. It's something that is not a flip of the switch, which I think we're hearing more and more that perception is maybe fading with some of our SMB customers, but it's still prevalent here. So to help offset that, starting small and scaling gradually, even if that means running small pilots within select teams, starting in phases, so deploying ZTNA in phases. And really, if we can target the most critical systems first and start with a view of network visibility, or start with network visibility, I should say, you can really establish a much more phased deployment approach here.
Yeah, and the advice I give to enterprises is understanding all the applications in your environment, the types of user groups that are accessing, the types of devices that are being used to access them. And I think that's still relevant for an SMB. We mentioned kind of technical issues. I mentioned specifically the idea of kind of web-based apps and non-web-based apps. Doing that due diligence, I think it's actually probably less of a process for a smaller organization. But going through that up front helps you understand, the tools, types of policies that you need to think about, and avoid some of those kind of hurdles that you didn't see coming down the road.
Yeah. The second one here, lack of expertise. This one, I think, I'm sure everyone who works at a small or medium-sized business, maybe not on the expertise side, but the resources and maybe IT budget side. But we encourage a lot of our customers to partner with an MSSP or managed security service provider or an MSP to offload some of those more complex tasks up front. And if you compare that with investments into training for your team, certifications, workshops to really handle the transition successfully. So we have a number of partners at OpenVPN, but obviously there's partners globally to support these sorts of transitions. And then an over reliance on tools. So we again talk to customers who might believe that by simply adopting a wide-ranging platform, it's going to solve all of their security issues. ignoring or deprioritizing on the process and the policy side. So putting together really clear security policies and enforcing on those best practices, like we've discussed here, MFA, encryption, least privilege access. Then you can use automation tools in tandem to help enforce your policies more consistently.
Yeah, and even, a tool like ZTNA, which I said earlier is probably most closely associated with zero trust. You can deploy a lot of ZTNA tools and not follow zero trust principles, right? It's all in the policy. These tools just have the ability to enforce zero trust policies to help you, um, you know, I said before, operationalize that architecture or that strategy. So you really do need to kind of do that work up front and understand how you're going to kind of use the tool. Not just think you put that tool in place and it's going to do the work for you, right? You said it well. I mean, it's really about the business policies, the security policies that you've established, and then how you enforce them.
And then no concern slide would be true to form without a cost concern. And John mentioned or alluded to cost and concerns around investments and things like that already. And I think while it can be perceived as expensive upfront, especially for smaller organizations that have limited IT budgets and resources, the cost of a breach is going to be much higher, whether you've experienced it firsthand or not. So looking for scalable solutions and ZTA solutions that are tailored for SMBs and focusing on incremental investments, where you're not forced into, to go all in from day one with providers, at least, where we were at Black Hat a few months ago. A lot of customers came up and felt like they were paying for shelfware, stuff they were never going to use. But when you're an SMB and you're working with a larger provider, there are things that you need to be, paying for, basically. So not focusing on going in all in from day one, but focusing on those incremental investments and looking to cloud-based services that can help with operational or infrastructure costs as well. And then here, failure to integrate with legacy systems. So older systems, of course, might not be compatible with a more contemporary ZTNA approach. You're going to have gaps in your security. So identifying and evaluating those legacy systems, whether it's through assessments or network scanners or things like that, but having a plan to upgrade or replace those that can't be secured under a ZTNA framework. And if your legacy systems can't be fully integrated, the layered approach is still one that we see a lot of customers actively working towards to still be able to segment access and add encryption. And then lastly here, overlooking continuous monitoring. So similar to the key fundamentals of deploying this, but overlooking continuous monitoring, continuous being the key word there. So once you've been able to deploy a ZTNA on some level across the org, failure to maintain that continuous monitoring and real-time detection again. So implementing automated tools that'll help scale with your business and again keep you alert of those anomalies will help mitigate those risks.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight too, doing that on across the environment, but within the session as well. So, again, zero trust is about not taking things for granted, not assuming trust just because, even 10 minutes ago you deemed something trustworthy. Things change, and you can only reassess that level of risk, that user or that entity presents if you are continually assessing, what it's doing, what it's accessing, what it's downloading, things like that. If you suddenly see a massive amount of data being downloaded, even though that user went through MFA and so on, obviously something's changed. So that's again where that monitoring and doing so on a continuous basis comes into play and is really important.
Yeah. So if we kind of combine this a little bit here and look at best practices for or from rather successful enterprise deployments, they fall into a couple of categories, many of which we've already discussed. But if we kind of combine this here into more of a clear roadmap, if you will, but starting with a clear strategy means that you're starting with your most critical assets, whether it's your financial systems, customer data, remote access, but taking that approach will allow you to scale in phases. And if you can ensure that each part of your business is secured before expanding further, then you'll have a much higher chance of being successful in the long run. A comprehensive IAM, we've mentioned this a few times here, but again, implementing MFA, SSO across your applications, services, starting again with those critical systems, but focus on making identity verification easy for your users, but still strong enough to battle any attacks and mitigating security risks. Adopting microsegmentation. So starting by segmenting your network between different departments or functional areas. But from there, classifying your data and prioritizing that most sensitive information. I've had a few conversations with customers either at shows or during other interviews where this part seems to be a piece that can be missing in some cases. Implementing continuous monitoring. So investing in again, those monitoring and logging tools, even if they're more basic, but to really, to get that starting point in place, ensuring endpoint security compliance. So implementing basic endpoint compliance checks. So making sure your devices have AV software, antivirus software, updated patches, encryption, using a ZTNA solution that includes device posture assessments before allowing folks to access the network. And then lastly, automating as much as possible, looking to automation tools to enforce access controls, monitor traffic, and being able to proactively respond to threats. John, I realize that you might have had a thought here on some of these. I'll pause and see if you want to add any thoughts here.
Just on the automation piece, a lot of zero trust is the interest there is because environments are more dynamic than ever before, and so security has to kind of follow suit. And the only way that really works at scale is through some level of automation. So, whether it's enforcement, policy, recommendations, monitoring and responses, there's all different level types, I should say, and there's going to be a comfort level that each organization has to have with how much they want to automate. But prioritizing tools that have those capabilities, allows you some flexibility to, again, change, add more automation over time. But it is really important to do this, at scale and continuously. Otherwise, security teams and IT teams have enough on their plate as is. It's tough to keep pace.
Yeah. So I want to close here by tying all this together into six sort of broad buckets here, and then we can get into any questions from the group here. But starting with identity and access. So starting by focusing on securing identities with MFA and other tools, phasing the deployment. We've talked about that in several use cases here. Leveraging cloud solutions, again, thinking about costs and minimizing operational costs. Investing in user education. So making sure your employees understand why and how ZTNA is going to improve their security. At the end of the day, educated users are much less likely to bypass those security measures if there's strong internal education. And then balancing security with usability. As John mentioned, too much friction is never a good thing, and in this case can lead to worsening or decreased productivity, or in many cases worse, employees creating workarounds. While at the same time, too little security obviously exposes you to increasing threats. And automation. And we've talked about, I think I'd probably beat the automation dead horse here, but this is where we see a lot of enterprises being able to effectively move in this direction is by leveraging as much automation as possible. So before we get into the Q&A, I do want to just make a couple of notes here on some of the ways that OpenVPN is supporting organizations in making this transition, and then we'll get into Q&A. Oh, John, I realize I'm not on camera. Sorry about that. Jeez. Let's start video here. So we have two core solutions that we work with our customers on to help them make this transition into more of a zero trust framework. And we're working with primarily a lot of small to medium sized businesses. So a lot of the fundamentals and pitfalls that we talked about are exactly what we're hoping to offset. So we have a self-hosted solution with that's called Access Server, which is going to give you obviously much more control. On the flip side, a cloud delivered solution that will offer more of a shared responsibility. So we provide the virtual networking platform. You're responsible for the connections to it. And one of the things that we get a lot of feedback on is actually on the pricing model. And we have a usage-based model, but it's on concurrent connections. And what I mean by that is it's not based on users or devices. It's on how many connections you have live at any given moment. So as you see an increasing number of headlines on return to work and everyone sending employees back to the office, we've gotten a lot of feedback on this pricing model, because if you're in the office Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're home Tuesday, Thursday, there's a cost effectiveness to that. And then in terms of network access with built-in security, so working with customers with features on network segmentation, role and attribute-based control, device identity checks, device posture assessments, and then on-demand scalability and simplified management. So our goal is to make it as seamless and easy for your users, while making it as centralized and giving you as much visibility, control, and management on the administrative side. So our end goal is to really support our SMB customers in making this transition from a cost-effective perspective and from a tailored perspective, meaning tailored to the needs of SMBs. Obviously, if you'd like to learn more, you can request a demo on our website. We have a lot of interactive demos, some great content that you can dive deeper if you'd like here. With that, though, let's move on to any questions from the group here. I will open up the Q&A. And as we're looking at questions here, John, I think I might ask the first one, and would like to get your thoughts on if anything was surprising in the research that you and the team did, or if anything stood out as being unexpected to what maybe your hypothesis was, or what you were expecting.
Yeah, a couple things I mentioned as I went through some of the trending data in a couple areas, and I didn't necessarily show trends from prior studies, but it was surprising how quickly some of that changed from when we ran this survey in the past. So from a definitional perspective, again, the leap from thinking about zero trust as a tool or technology to a strategy, we figured it would move in that direction, but the scale at which it did and how quickly it did was surprising, and how quickly organizations kind of are moving from more targeted use cases to broader implementations. That was a bigger jump than I thought as well. But the other piece was, the tactical drivers, to be truthful, the reducing incidents and data breaches were maybe lower than I would have thought, and some of that might be that it's just assumed that that's what zero trust is going to do. Another piece we've talked about in the past was SMBs maybe not appreciating that as much, kind of the security through obscurity perspective, and maybe that not being as on the radar as it should. But everyone's a target. I think everyone should have that in mind as a table stake driver for zero trust. Is I'm going to make my security team's job easier by stopping things from occurring before they even do. So hopefully next time we run this, that changes a bit as well.
Yeah, great. I as we're waiting for any final questions from the group here, another one that I'll toss your way. So in one of the polls we had, there was a sizable number of folks who had already started the process of moving to more of a zero trust model. So for those SMBs and SMBs specifically that have already have started the transition, or who have already successfully deployed zero trust across the organization, based on what you see with the enterprise, where do you think priorities will start to shift after that. Where are folks, where are they and where should they be focused on from a framework or from a set of tools perspective after, after zero trust or even in tandem with zero trust?
Yeah, again, and I'm probably slightly biased just because of the area that I cover, but I spend a lot of time on SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, and SSE, Security Service Edge, and we've seen over time this kind of concept of zero trust broadly, and SASE and SSE come closer and closer together, and ZTNA kind of be the facilitator in the middle, and the overlay kind of between tools and strategy. Um, you know, I think enterprise organizations have been slower on the true adoption of SASE or SSE from a single or two vendor type of approach for all the reasons I talked about earlier. They have a lot of tools, different groups involved in the strategy and buying process and so on. From an SMB perspective, I mean, I go back to covering the idea of UTMs, which is an evolution of firewall, and SSE. SASE in a lot of ways is the next evolution of that concept in a more cloud-centric form factor. So as I'm thinking about zero trust and how I modernize secure access to kind of private apps in my network, expanding that out to the internet and public SaaS apps and things like that, at a minimum, and that starts to get into SASE and SSE, can make a lot of sense. Again, that gets more into tools and technologies, but I do think that's a logical next step.
Great. Okay, we have a quiet group today, so I'm going to end us here and say, John, thank you again for your time and input and walking us through some of the research that you've completed there. Here's a few other ways that you could connect with us at OpenVPN, some things that we're reading. Again, our presentation today was recorded, so we'll share the link out with everyone after today's call here. And John, a final thank you to you and for everyone who was able to attend today. Have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.